Welcome back to another SY3 screencast, and what we're going to look at in this presentation is the concept of democracy. So remember, this SY3 unit is called Understanding Politics, and it's based around four broad and overlapping themes: the concept of power, the concept of democracy, the role of the state, and different forms of political participation. And in terms of the structure of your learning, we're introducing each of these themes in an introductory way so that you've got a good overview of the key themes of this course and that you've got the building blocks in place that you need in order to be successful. And then later on, once we've finished introducing the key themes, we then go back to each of them in turn and develop them in more depth and detail. So most modern political systems make the claim that they are democracies. So let's have a look at what that idea is meant to refer to. The concept of democracy goes back to the ancient Greek city-states, and the term democracy literally means rule by the people. But we should note that in the ancient Greek city-states where this term originated, the people did not include women or slaves, whereas nowadays, when a state claims to be a democracy, the people generally refers to all adult citizens. So there are only certain groups that are now excluded from the definition of the people, and they might include non-nationals, along with convicted criminals and the mentally insane. A very famous interpretation of the concept of democracy comes from President Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, in which he extolled the virtues of what he called government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And these things are obviously ideals, and judged against these democratic ideals, even the most secure and established democracies are found wanting. In other words, in practice, it's often quite difficult to live up to these principles. Now, there are two main forms that democracy takes. On the one hand, there's the purest version of democracy, which was practiced in the ancient Greek states, called direct democracy. And this is a participatory form of democracy where there's no division between the rulers and the ruled. All of the people within a particular community participate in making the decisions that affect them. Whereas indirect democracy is a form of representative democracy. So in this type of system, there is a division between the rulers and the ruled. So the people elect rulers, they elect representatives to take decisions on their behalf. And if they don't like those decisions, then they get the opportunity at an election to remove those leaders and to elect other representatives. Now, scarcely any modern industrial society could claim to practice direct democracy in the way that it was practiced in ancient Greece. Switzerland perhaps comes closest with its frequent use of referendums. Now, a referendum is where the public are given a direct vote on a question about a particular issue or policy. So that means that the public can make a direct decision on a question by voting yes or no, rather than letting their elected representatives decide on their behalf. However, in contrast to Switzerland, referendums are rarely used in the UK. However, there will be a referendum, I think in 2014, in Scotland to see whether or not the Scottish people want Scotland to leave the UK and become an independent nation state in its own right. Although modern states cannot really be characterised as direct democracies in any meaningful sense, there are examples of new social movements, so political protest movements, who have tried to practice the principles of direct democracy. And an example that we'll look at in more detail in class is the Occupy movement that emerged in New York in the autumn of 2011 and spread to many other cities around the world. And sociologists such as Manuel Castells have argued that the Occupy movement emerged partly as a response to the crisis of legitimation in representative democracy within countries such as the UK and the US. And what he means by this is the idea that people in representative democracies have become disillusioned with their political systems, that they no longer trust their politicians to truly reflect the will of the people. So the Occupy movement, for example, argued that representative democracy in countries like the US and UK had become corrupted by the power of banks and big corporations. So in contrast to the corruption of representative democracy, what the Occupy movement sought to do was to practice a purer form of direct democracy, a participatory democracy with general assemblies held to discuss issues at the various Occupy sites. And in order to put this into practice, the Occupy movement tried to abide by a principle of horizontalism. And this is where a group has a very loosely defined organisational structure without any clearly defined leadership or hierarchy. So this flat power structure that we call horizontalism was meant to encourage the type of collaboration and deliberation needed to put the principles of direct democracy into practice. The other case study of a community based on the principles of direct democracy that we'll explore in more detail in class is the example of Summerhill School in Suffolk. This is a school where lessons are optional, where exams are optional, where children have the right to play all day if they want to, and it's also a school that is run as a direct democracy. So what you can see in this picture is the school meeting. So they have meetings on a regular basis, and the laws of the school are democratically made within these decisions, and every member of the school community, so that means both pupils and teachers, can come to these meetings, raise issues, and everybody has one vote. So in class we'll look at this case study in a bit more detail, and we use it to identify some of the strengths and weaknesses of direct democracy. The other form that democracy takes, which is much more common, is what we call indirect democracy, or more commonly it's known as representative democracy. So in today's large and more industrialised societies, people cannot all get together to discuss and vote on issues in the way that they were able to in the ancient Greek city-states. So the compromise is that people elect representatives to act on their behalf. So this obviously means that elections are central to the idea of indirect democracy, representative democracy, and the role of the people is consigned to the role of deciding who will decide. So we go to a polling station and we usually have a choice of candidates who normally belong to political parties, and our role is to choose one of these representatives to make decisions on our behalf. So this is still obviously a form of people power, but it's a much more limited one than the case of direct democracy. So the voters are given away the right to decision making to a small number of elected representatives who make decisions on their behalf. However, because elections are held frequently, if the people do not like the decisions that are taken on their behalf, then obviously they get the opportunity to vote for a new set of representatives at the following election. And this, at least in principle, is meant to ensure that elected representatives remain accountable to the people. Now, even though it's often taken for granted that democracy is a good thing, we need to remember that even within Western societies, there have always been concerns about democracy. So this is Thomas Jefferson, one of the architects really of the modern American system of government. But Thomas Jefferson voiced a well-known theory of democracy. He said that a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49. So one of the big fears about democracy has always been this fear that it might turn into a tyranny of the majority. And therefore, to safeguard the rights of minority groups and to protect people's civil liberties, things like the right to free speech and the right to protest, modern Western democracies often have safeguards to protect these liberties. And we use the term liberal democracy to describe an indirect or representative democracy that has adequate safeguards for minority groups and civil liberties. And often these important freedoms are entrenched in a document called a Bill of Rights. So a Bill of Rights, you can see the American Bill of Rights here, is a list of the most important rights to the citizens of a particular country. And the purpose of the Bill of Rights is to protect those rights against infringement.